Hi, everyone. So yesterday, Lucas and Maria took us through governance and management of a volunteer-based organization. The first thing we did was to assess who a typical volunteer is. So some said a volunteer is likely to be a student who wants to gain experience and is enthusiastic about learning. Others said it can be a mid-career professional who is interested in working towards policy change. We moved on to identify the opportunities that come with volunteers governing an organization. So first, it's more likely to lead to a democratic, or it's more likely to be democratic, considering that the decisions made will be representative of the people that work in the organization. Second, such bottom-up approach to governance is likely to be an honest process. So the decisions made, will be made honestly. Then we moved on to identify the opportunities that come with volunteers managing a think tank. And a lot of opportunities were highlighted. First, we're likely to draw from a pool of of people with diverse expertise. It also creates a wider network and increases the quantity of research outputs as well. It infuses passion and creativity into the process. The think tank is more likely to recognize emerging topics, considering that these volunteers are spread, across the place, and also that they are involved in different spheres. Also, it's likely to be an entry point for students and for people who have just finished school as well, and a place where they can easily develop. And one key aspect that we really dwelt on was, how do we ensure that despite volunteers running an organization, how do we ensure that there is still a common vision, common expectations, and that the research output is top notch? And so Lucas said in Forehouse, there is an onboarding process as soon as the volunteers come. There are several exchanges between volunteers and the management. And also before volunteers, begin to write, they have to put out an idea draft to ascertain how relevant the research question is. And there is also a review board that assesses the research output. And there was something he said that really stuck with me. He said from his experience, volunteer engagements are hardly ever altruistic. So they each come with their own expectations. And so for those of us who are interested in setting up think tanks or, working with volunteers, it's important for us to find that balance between what the volunteers expect and what the organizations also need. And also Maria said she can help us with publishing, which I think is a good will be great. And the Policy Kitchen link was shared yesterday as well. It's basically a platform that crowdsources ideas that can be used to address foreign policy challenges. Those were my takeaways. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Ma. I think that was an excellent summary, highlighted most of the key points, and everything that you've mentioned seems also relevant, not for volunteer-based organizations, but it's good practice in general that can be taken to other types of organizations. And with that, let me introduce today. I'm very happy to welcome for the second time Lizza Bomassi, who is the Deputy Director of Carnegie Europe, where she's responsible for harmonizing their strategic and operational priorities and managing relations with Carnegie's global centers and programs, as well as partner organizations in Europe. She has a background in communication and development studies. And previously, Lizza worked for the East-West Institute's International Task Force on Preventive Diplomacy, a group of leading decision makers working to make conflict prevention a reality. During her time there, she helped establish the Parliamentarians Network for Conflict Prevention and the Global Conference on Preventive Action. Before this, Lizza worked for Save the Children in Pakistan and Afghanistan on emergency relief and humanitarian assistance programs for Afghan refugees in Pakistan and internationally displaced people in Afghanistan. And she spent some time working in the private sector in France. I'm also very happy to welcome her today. This is the second time she'll be joining in the School for Thinktankers. And last session, it was great. So I'm looking forward for today. Lizza will be discussing governance and management and the challenges of leadership. Lizza, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you. As Andrea said, I did this in person last year, but obviously pandemic conditions don't allow us to be together. But I'm really looking forward to doing the session with you. And if you have any questions, please raise your virtual hand and let me know. So as Andrea said, I'm the Deputy Director of Carnegie Europe, which is a European foreign policy think tank. We are one of 6 centers of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is one of the oldest foreign and security policy think tanks in the world. Carnegie Endowment was established in 1910, thanks to a bequeathment by Andrew Carnegie. So our other centers are in Delhi, in Beijing, in Beirut, Moscow, Washington, and Brussels. I thought it might be interesting to talk to you a little bit about how we're funded, because when people come into contact with the endowment, they often think that we're a grant-making organization. We're actually not. That's one of the other confusions that comes with our name is when Andrew Carnegie passed away, he actually established 30 different organizations and hundreds of libraries in the United States as well as around the world. And our endowment, which is now at about 300 million, helps us to cover probably 50% of our annual budget, which is about 30 million per year. We have 200 staff across the world in all 6 centers, and our programmatic priorities range from nuclear non-proliferation to governance and democracy challenges, to cybersecurity and etc. So that's sort of a quick snapshot of the endowment, if you'll let me make that small plug, Andrea. As we start going into the session, I'm hoping that we'll have a little bit of time towards the end. So if you could think, as we're talking, and reflect on how the pandemic has affected your organization's operational workings, and the lessons that you've learned, because I'd like to talk about that with you. It's also an opportunity to learn and share. From the beginning, I'll just set a couple of ground rules. I have a number of slides that I wanted to go through, but I really would like this to be interactive because, being on the screen, we sort of miss that element of personal contact. So I'll stop fairly frequently, and if we can have a discussion. And again, if you have any questions or want me to stop at any point because you want clarification, I don't know if I can see all of the screens, but either say please stop or raise your virtual hand. So I'm going to I prepared a PowerPoint for you all. Let me just see if I can. I was trying this with Christina earlier and it was working, so bear with me. Here we go. Can you see that? Okay, fantastic. So that was the first slide. Oh dear. Okay, second slide. Okay. So we're going to talk today about leading a think tank and its key functions and challenges. But before we even get to that, I'd like to get to the Uber title first, which is governance and management. What is governance? For me, governance is this social contract. It's sort of an implicit agreement that governs all of our interactions, both internally and externally. And then the management part is the processes that manage that social contract. Now, I think something that's interesting about think tanks, and I talked a lot about this last year, is that we don't have a natural constituency, right? We're not an inherent part of democracy. We're sort of the non-essential bit. And I think that creates challenges for think tanks because you really have to show your added value since you're non-essential. But it also creates opportunities and conditions for you to really excel and to push yourself. I use the word value in two ways. One is value in its actual sense, like, what are you bringing to the table? But it's also the plural definition of it in terms of your integrity, the quality of your work, and the autonomy and independence that you as a think tank represent. I think that's important to mention because a few years ago, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but a few years ago, there was a bit of an inflection moment, at least in Western think tanks, that came, it was brought about by an article that was published in the New York Times, which talked about the work that think tanks were doing and how we were being instrumentalized towards certain ends by funding, funders in particular. And a number of our peers, Carnegie's peers, were actually called out in that article. And it provoked an inflection moment where we started to really, not that we weren't thinking about it before, but we really started to think about what we were doing and how we were doing that. And when you're a think tank, you're confronted by all sorts of challenges in terms of, and mainly funding. Where is your next project going to come from? How are you going to pay for the staff that you have under your employ? There are these sort of, real world challenges which translate into you maybe needing to do things that you're not necessarily always comfortable with. And the reason that I mention this is we've seen, I think, in the past years how organizations, both good and bad, can use online tools in both moral and immoral ways. Now, organizations like Carnegie, and I think a lot of think tanks, at least in the Western Hemisphere, do this, is we do a lot of data collection. We do beta testing methodologies. We try to see how audiences can engage with the message and the research that we're putting out there. And we do that in a very, what we call altruistic way, but we've seen how that can very easily be hijacked by people with malintent. So I think, leaving the moral boundaries aside of us collecting all of that data and how long you're spending on our websites and whether you're clicking on an email that you've received, the point is that good and bad organizations use these tools. And it goes back to the point that I was mentioning about values, what you as an organization represent. And I think you really need to think about that and be critical about what you're putting out there and how you're doing it. One added complication that we've faced also, and I think a lot of think tanks face this, is that donors are increasingly asking for what we call impact. When you're writing your funding proposal, and towards the end of that process, when you're writing your report on the project, your donors want to see that you've had impact. But I think that's very difficult to do in a context where you're producing ideas and you're giving policy advice, because you can't actually quantify in the same way that, a car company who produces X number of cars and sells X number of cars can do. There's no way that you can prove quantifiably that you have changed policy or that you have that this specific piece of research that you've done has actually contributed to that. So we found other ways to do that, and we are being increasingly awarded funding based on the impact that we have. And so I think we need to be vigilant about that. And that goes back to the first word in all of this is this social contract. So that's sort of the first thing that I wanted to mention. Do you have any questions or comments at this stage? Sorry, I can't see everybody's screen. Andrea, can I keep going?
Sorry, I was muted. I think there are no questions at the moment.
Okay. All right. So again, these are some of the questions which I think come to my mind when I think about this question about the social contract and governance and management challenges. Who are think tanks accountable to? And this will vary by region and by sector. In Europe, a lot of think tanks are funded. I'd say about half of the think tanks are actually funded by political parties, and this is something that you find happening quite often. I think in Germany, there are quite a few in France as well, and they have a very specific mandate, and they're accountable to their constituencies directly there. But that might be different, for example, in Asia or Africa or in Latin America, where think tanks are accountable to maybe directly their funders, their board. I think it's important to ask those questions. And again, like, what and whose purpose do we serve? How much influence should we have? I think we have a little bit of a romanticized notion about think tanks. There's this image that I like to use whenever I talk about the work that we do, this truth to power. It's this court jester. I don't know if you have seen this image before. It sits in the painting actually not with a laptop. There's books. I've kind of modified it for the virtual age. But this painting sits in a museum in Warsaw. And for me, think tanks are this sort of like this court jester who, back in the olden days, the court jester could speak to the king and tell him the truth, but almost in a half-joking way, even though what he was saying was really true. So I think it's sort of, it sort of reflects what we are as think tankers. Is we need to speak truth to power, but we need to be careful about how we do that and really reflect on that. Saw something come up in the chat. How do you measure impact? I find it hard to measure think tank work in KPIs. This is from Sophie. The policy making process. Let me just stop there so we can talk. Stop share. How do you measure impact? I find it hard to measure things in KPI. The policy is not linear, exactly, but often messy with lots of different interests and actors, and often it takes more than a set of projects to increase your visibility. Yeah. Of course. So I think that, if it's okay with you, let's pause there for a minute and actually talk about that, because I think impact is important. Now, Carnegie, as I said in the beginning, half of our funding comes from our endowment. And that doesn't mean that we don't need to report on, how effective our work is being. I recognize that not a lot of think tanks actually have that luxury. There are a lot of think tanks whose full funding has to come from external sources, and you are, accountable to multiple donors and have to report on them. The experience that we've had, at least from our work with mainly European funders, because I'm speaking from a European perspective here, is it depends if you're working. There's sort of three baskets of donors. One are the government donors who come to you with very specific metrics, and when you receive a grant agreement, you sort of you have a document which outlines very clearly what they're expecting you to report on. The second basket of donors are the individual donors or private foundations, and they can be more flexible just in terms of what they expect from you. And then the third kind are I hesitate to use the word corporate funders, but some think tanks actually do use a sort of a corporate circle where they go to companies and they collect, 2% or 5% of their annual budget, and you contribute as an organization towards that. And those are usually untied gifts that are received. So there's different levels of giving, and there you don't need to measure your impact, in the sense that corporate donors, they tend to affiliate with you because they like your brand. They like the fact that they are being seen as supporting a good cause. And it's, this is where we come into competition the most, I think, with NGOs who are doing actual tangible work, and actually, I'll take my experience from a while back, where you're implementing school feeding programs, or giving basic health and education in parts of the world which need it. So corporate donors that are working with think tanks don't expect that kind of reporting from you. I think the most challenging ones probably are the government donors, because they're not just individually responsible. Like, it's not like a foundation where it's self-contained. Government donors also have constituencies, right? So they have to apply in order, if you're working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, they have to apply annually for budgets so that they can also distribute those funds to other organizations. And I think you're actually probably going to cover this. When is the funding session, Andrea? Tomorrow? Yeah. Sorry, you're muted. I can't hear you.
We have some 3 funding sessions next week.
Okay, yeah. So I won't go too much into that, because I don't want to step on anyone's toes. But in terms of in terms of measuring our impact, we've tended to rely heavily on metrics. So our comms team, for example, whenever a publication is put out there, we actually monitor the number of times a mail has been clicked on, and how long people have spent online, and how engagement is on social media like Twitter or on Facebook, because those are the ways in which you also outreach your message, right? So we don't tend to anymore print a lot of our publications, because at least in the West, everything tends to be digital now. And people very rarely, I think, pick up a book anymore and just leaf through it and go through it. So we can actually quantify that in terms of engagement numbers. But it's very difficult to say that, so for example, if you have a specific piece of policy advice that came in one of your research papers, and then 2 weeks later you saw that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had actually picked up a piece of your policy advice without specifically referencing it, how can you say that it was because of the advice that you had given? That's very difficult to make the case for. I think, regardless if it is difficult or not, a lot of think tanks use that anyway. One of the things that I think is quite common with think tanks that are working in foreign policy is it's very rare that you'll find voices that are completely off the grid. We tend to say the same things. We tend to make the same recommendations. So, Carnegie could say, it's thanks to this research paper that we put out that this policy has changed. But you could very well see another organization like Chatham House also making the same claim, because it's not quantifiable in that sense. So in terms of impact, we tend to rely really on the quantitative metrics that we are able to track and monitor. I hope that answers your question. Government donors use public, so they need to. Yes, exactly, Teresa. That's correct. Impact that arises from attributing your work or study to a particular policy change. Right, Truka, did I answer your question on that? Sorry, I can't see you. So.
Yes, to an extent.
Okay, and then I have Marcel. How do these quantitative metrics look like? Marcel, I can't see you. I wonder if I can actually just, there you are, okay. You mean in a donor report or?
no, I mean, you said because it's so hard to ascertain where the idea came from, you rely
Yeah,
on quantitative metrics to measure your impact. So
yeah.
is that number of downloads of a research paper, or like what are these quantitative metrics that you then use?
What we track, sure.
Mm.
So now I'm not the comms person, so I'm caveating this by saying that I only get the reports that our teams put together and I see them. But, you know, I think one easy way to do that is, you know, on Twitter, you tweet about it, you know, you as a scholar could tweet about the report, but then other people in your organization retweet you. So, you know, you've got numbers of impressions. You can also track the amount of time people actually spend on a web page, because even if you get an email, for example, you get an email with the most recent publication, sometimes that ends up in spam filters, but then people also click on it. So you can count the number of click rates. But if it's just 5 seconds, that means that that person hasn't actually scrolled down to the bottom. So there are ways actually that we can monitor how long you were spending on a web page and if you've scrolled all the way down. Now, governments are increasingly aware of this. And for example, in Europe, we have, I'm sure some of you are aware of GDPR, which is this general data protection regulation, which actually threw think tanks in for a bit of a spin, just because we knew that it was coming, but we were not really prepared for it. And it wasn't normally aimed towards the think tanks or NGO sector. It was mainly aimed towards organizations actually like Facebook and Twitter that collect a lot of this information about users and then sell them on to companies and advertisers. But we as think tanks had to adjust to that. And I think if you watch the cyber and privacy space a little bit, it's increasingly becoming, GDPR is increasingly becoming, what's the word? Like a standard across different countries and different regions. So last year, the European Union and Japan, for example, negotiated a GDPR space where their data could be shared together. But that affects you as a think tank, because if you're collecting these metrics and you need to report on them when you are doing, you know, your funding reports, you have to do that in ways that are not contravening the regulations that are being put into place. And unfortunately, again, I say this, I realize I'm saying this from quite a luxury perspective, because it's Carnegie, we have people who are advising us internally about how to handle GDPR, but not everybody is in that luxury position. It's expensive to go to a lawyer and ask them specific questions about how GDPR is going to, or a GDPR-esque model is going to affect your operations. And I think, but you need to be aware of that and keep an eye on how your data collection for your funding requirements is going to affect you as a think tank, because the fines can be very, very high. I mean, the costs of actually hiring experts to give you advice is also quite high, but it's much less high than being fined for breaches of privacy. I don't know if there are anything people here who are also based in Europe and could share some of their own experience with this, or if you want to. Otherwise, we can move on. So Sophie, sometimes qualitative is more important than quantitative. Yes, I agree with that. And then Rawan, how do you assess these numbers? What are good numbers? I'll talk a little bit about that actually in benchmarking. So there's two ways to assess numbers. One is you can actually, if you have several programs within your think tank. One, for example, that looks at governance and democracy, and the other one which looks at cyber policy, or the other one that looks at social policy or environmental policy. You can sort of, this might sound a bit mean, but you can have an internal competition and see whose numbers are doing better. You can also compare that with other think tanks. What we've done in the past, and I mean, we don't do this systematically in terms of comparing numbers or click rates, but we do it in other sectors. So for example, a couple of years ago, Carnegie Europe was involved in a benchmarking exercise with other think tanks here, just to look at what kind of job descriptions we had across think tanks for specific positions. So, for example, researchers at Carnegie were compared with researchers at another organization and another organization, so that you can get a lay of the land of what is being asked to different think tanks. And you could also, I don't think that there are many think tanks that actually share their Twitter numbers or number of click rates. Again, this is related to GDPR and privacy concerns. But you could do that informally by reaching out to your peers and other organizations and just asking them, you know, you released this policy paper on environmental impact. How many people did you read that? And you can share your numbers. I think it's called in management tools, it's called benchmarking, and it gives you a good gauge of how useful a specific policy area that you're researching is, and what audiences can also be more interested in. So, but I think people tend to not want to share those numbers just because it is an internal thing. So again, it's very much linked to the relationships that you have externally with other organizations and think tanks. So unless there are any other questions, can we move on? Okay. Sorry, I'm still adjusting to Teresa had a question. Okay, Teresa, sorry.
Hello, Lisa. My name is Teresa, and I work for the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a pan-European think tank, and actually work in the Rome office in Italy. Okay. I'm based in Italy. I think that what we went through in the last 10 years was a huge change, a paradoxical huge change in the way a think tank works. I mean, with the financial crisis, we had a very dramatic issue with donors, with sponsorship, because, I mean, companies, business didn't have the money anymore they used to have in the past. So we moved from core funding, exclusive core funding, where companies were able to give you money just to be part of a project, of an idea, to specific project funded fundraising, which I think everybody agree on the fact that it's really difficult. And there are so many expectations with little money. The reporting process is really complicated. So that was the first obstacle. Then with the COVID crisis, the second came out. We managed to settle a little bit after the first one. Then we got COVID, where we could not, for example, do any more events. So we were put in the position to prove our impact in different ways we weren't used to. So as you said, I mean, the communication dimension took a stronger, I mean, currently have more important than in the past. Your impact can be measurable with your meetings, with the people you put your colleagues in contact with, for example, from your national MFAs or other Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But my question is, how long this new model, I mean, can survive? I mean, my fear is that very soon we will move toward a third stage, let's say, where proving our impact like we are doing now in a very emergency situation where we cannot spend the money of our donors, but we need to show them that we use them for staff costs. And I think that everybody knows that donors don't really like having staff costs cover when they give you money. So my fear is that very soon, maybe before the summer break or after, we will move as think tank in a new problematic area of our work, where we we won't have any new ideas, more ideas to prove our partners how successful we are and how, in very practical terms, how we use their money. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I mean, that's a really good point, and it's something that I think we in Western Europe and also in the northern part of the world are actually facing quite a lot, because we have had to move a lot of our activities online. I think when the pandemic first started, we initially just thought, okay, this is a blip, it'll last 6 months, and we moved a lot of our output, events. Research is also more challenging now, because you can't use the usual methodologies that you were using in the past. So that's also starting to really impact. But everything sort of coalesced in the fall, and in the fall we were still stuck inside. And as you said, I think, who knows what's going to happen 6 months from now. I think it is going to be a moment of reckoning. We've already seen a number of think tanks just collapse, because they've closed, let's be frank, they haven't been able to keep up. This was already happening a few years ago, and I think we're going to see an acceleration of that. But I think at the same time, there's also a growing number of think tanks in the global south. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I get the impression that there are increasingly more think tanks on the other side of the world, which are adjusting, and I think, what was it, Darwin's survival of the fittest, and I think that's really what's going to start happening over the next few years. Is we're going to see a bit of an implosion, and the number of think tanks will go down, because we're not going to be able to sustain our own funding models unless you have an endowment or something else like that. But we are focusing a lot on the funding part. And again, Andrea, I'm sort of conscious that we shouldn't be, because I don't want to step on too many other toes, and you have other sessions as well. So I just saw another point here from Marcel about, yeah, absolutely, I agree. Like, you might have all of these numbers, and that's great, and that might be impressive, but how do you know that that's not, 1,000 university students? Not to say that you shouldn't be educating the younger generation, but you want to be targeting those top 5 policymakers, right? But there's different types of engagement strategies as well. So we tend to use, and again, I'm probably stepping on another session's toes here, but we tend to use different methodologies for different audiences. So Twitter and social and the sort of public outreach part is much more geared towards our informed general publics. But within each department, within each research pillar at Carnegie, if you ask the heads of those departments, each of them probably have a list of 10 specific people in their field that they know they want reading their papers, and there's a very different cultivation strategy towards them than there is towards the other part. I mean, for us, measuring the kind of metrics that I'm talking about on social and public and website, that's really just to impress our donors, to say, look, this is, and then you bring in the funding. But at the end of the day, you want to be talking to those 5 or 10 people in that specific department, in that specific ministry that you want listening to the research that you're, and there you're convening private meetings with them, you're giving them private briefings, which again makes it much harder to do in a context where you're all virtual. But pre-pandemic, these are the things that we were doing, and you can't advertise that. There's a trust relationship there that you can't say, oh, I met with X at the ministry and he or she. You can't say that to your donors, and I think this is where your brand and the values that we talked about earlier, integrity, your autonomy, your independence, those are all very important in terms of the trust that you get as a think tank, and the trust that is given to you by people outside of your organization. So I don't see any more hands. I don't see any more chats. So I'll try to move on, because I'm pretty sure we're going to run out of time. Sorry, Andrea.
If everybody's enjoying the conversation and learning from it, we adapt. Like
yes,
with
exactly. I had so much I wanted to tell you guys. No. So let me just go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. So I think you guys have already talked about different think tanks. You probably already covered that earlier this week. Different think tanks come in different shapes and sizes. We have different products, resources. We're all in different markets. My PowerPoint is not changing. Just one second, because I had another. There we go. So I think one useful way to think about the key functions in a think tank are this, what I call the VCR pillars. Now, the VCR is a nod to my 80s background. For those of you that are too young to know what a VCR is, please don't ask, it's embarrassing. But for me, VCR actually stands for, the first thing is for vision. You have clear priorities, your think tank knows what it wants to do, and it has a strategy for doing that. C stands for competence. It means, that the key operational functions, I'm talking about communications, about development and fundraising, project execution, administration, finance, all of the sort of the back office stuff, the non-visible stuff is being done, but it's being done by professionals. I know that in some instances it's very difficult to hire the amount of staff that you need in order to do this professionally, but I think it's such an important part of what you have to have as a think tank. And then the last part, which is also extremely important, is your research. This is your value proposition to the outside world. And I think all three are critical. Without communications, for example, your research is not going to get read. Without our scholars, without our research, there's no job for our operations. And without a vision, you have no direction. So that's sort of one way which I like to think of the critical functions within a think tank, and those are distributed amongst different departments and teams. And you could be small with just 3 people, or you could be big with 200 or more. But they're basically within those 3 baskets. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was leadership, organizational management competencies. I think managers, leaders, they have to have a lot of energy. They have to deal constantly with change. They have to deal constantly with resistance. They need to be innovative, and they have to be there all the time. So what makes a good leader? I think you may have talked about this already yesterday from the presentation at the beginning of the session. I heard some points which I also wanted to make. So for me, there are 2 things. There was a study that was done by a professor at Harvard University a few years ago, where he studied successful CEOs. And there were 2 things that he discovered they all had in common. The first was a vision, having clear priorities, having a clear strategy. But the other one was also having a good network. Networking is not easy for human beings. It makes you uncomfortable. It's shallow, but it's crucial. It's not fun or easy, but it is critical. But you can't just have networking. It's not just about going to conferences and meeting people. Yes, that is part of it, but you have to have a plan for it. You have to be systematic about it. You have to have rules of engagement, because this is based on how you're building your social capital. It's something that, I think you have to invest the time in thinking through and how you're going to target specific people. I mean, it sounds very mechanical, and it also might sound a little bit Machiavellian, but if you really want to do it well and properly, you actually need to invest the time and think about how you are going to build your network, especially as a leader. Okay, so these are, the 2, I think, preconditions for successful leadership. But what else? Because I showed you earlier these 3 pillars, vision, which we're talking about now, competence. For me, this is a lot also about your staff. Soft power, leads to commitment, whereas hard power, I think, leads to compliance. And do you want staff who are compliant, or do you want staff who are committed? That's a question that you have to ask yourself. And that means that you have to have good people skills. There are people skills that make you good for your team, and you as a people manager need to promote. Over the years that I've been in the think tank world, and even just generally in life, I think there are 5 qualities that a team needs. The first is trust. You need to empower your staff. You need to delegate responsibility and recognize their contributions and accomplishments. Respect. Foster an inclusive work environment, lead with empathy and develop them, invest the time and resources in order to give them trainings, things like that. Accountability is also important. Allocate time and resources to your staff, make decisions and commit to them. Communicate clearly. Humility is being aware of your own viability. And then integrity, be fair and professional, be open and honest, deliver feedback, both positive and corrective. I think your teams really need this. And it's, a few years ago, before Donald Trump had come into office, I remember sitting down with my boss at the time, and he's one of the foremost experts on democracy. And at the time, we were really worried about Trump winning the presidency. And I said to him, well, it'll be fine. Even if he does win, those institutions are still going to survive, but they'll still be in place. And I remember him saying to me, Lizza, at the end of the day, those institutions, they're just buildings. Those buildings are filled with people, and those people reflect the leadership that is in place. And so going back again to that social contract, I think, you as an organization really do reflect the values, and you give them to your team. And I think you might be striving for the best, but I think you have to strive for the best, and you need to do that, because it's very difficult to give your best and to do your best in the context of a situation where people are just awful to each other, if you know what I mean. So that's one area which I think, as managers, as leaders, you need to invest in your team and your staff, not just your operational staff, your scholars as well. Everybody needs this. But there's also what, in addition, you as a leader need to have. And I think there's also 5 key traits, which are sort of the dark side of think tanking, but I'll talk about them anyway, because I've noticed this in all of the leaders that I've seen. A leader needs relevance. So this is about your criticality. How important are you? Are you contributing to something that's strategically critical? The second is uniqueness. Are you difficult to replace? There's this myth that managers are this sort of elite group that are untouchable. But I think the truth is most managers and most leaders are actually very replaceable. I think as a group, leaders are powerful, but individually, they're politically weak. The third thing is centrality. Power is not always situated at the top. The one thing that I like to use as an example is your budget director, for example, not necessarily at the top, maybe somewhere near the top, but your budget director actually has a lot of power. They know a lot about the organization. They know how much everybody makes. They know which donors are giving how much money to which programs and centers and departments. They're not necessarily always on top, but they have a lot of centrality. So think about that. Autonomy, that means that you don't need to depend on others to be successful. And then visibility is the last one, that your power is recognized by others. I mean, there's no point in having power if nobody knows about it. So I'll just pause there for a second and just see if we have any questions, or if you feel free to disagree with the list that I've put out there.
I think Sophie has a question.
Sophie, please.
Hi. Thanks for making all these points. I think they're super interesting. It was less a question, more of a comment, reminding me of a training I did a few years back, where that was really kind of eye-opening for me, because we have this very strong hierarchy in mind most of the times. And the trainer said that basically we're all leaders independent of our position within the organization, because we all can influence colleagues. And I found that was really interesting, because it changed my kind of vision or my relationship to power. And I realized, even if you're not maybe the top executive manager of a think tank, you still have either some colleagues or have some kind of responsibility towards either your team members that are at the same level or your interns, and they, like, how you will influence them in a way or another. And that's also some kind of leadership, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think these are values to strive for and to aspire towards. And I think they also reflect you as an organization, right? Like, no organization wants to be seen negatively. I mean, unless you're narcissistic, so I don't know. But in general, I think you need to emulate those values across the board, as you said, towards your interns as well. It's also about mentoring people who are coming in and showing them, I've had a lot of bosses in my life. I've had some really difficult and bad bosses, but I've also learned a lot from them in terms of, this is what I don't want to be, and this is what I don't want to share with others. And I've also had excellent bosses who have not been so great in terms of the output, but they've been really kind. So it's difficult. It's difficult to be a good leader. It's difficult to be a good manager, and you have to constantly work at it. And as I said, people think that being a leader is great but you have an enormous amount of pressure on you from all sides constantly, from the top, from the bottom, across, and you need to always be on your game, because there's always somebody else just, waiting to come in and snap up your spot. Any other questions? Okay, well, we can then move on.
There's a question by Chamta.
Okay, sorry.
I'm Chanda from Myanmar. It's not question, like, I want to discuss about the impact. And my understanding, the think tank is like not only knowledge production, like a more advocacy, and also they have a like specific mission to influence something, right? Oh, actually, it's like according to the MNE, like Montana evaluation, like just a click, just a download. That this is like a more knowledge production, like a research, like a academia institution. Like advocacy is more, then that is more advocacy to influence their policy. Like my organization are working for healthy service space. But last year, we are trying to influence the donor about the co-funding for civil society. Like is last year and last 2009 and advocate to the Switzerland embassy. And now this day, Switzerland FIDA is make a decision to their partner, to their Swedish international NGO to make a funding for only co-funding to their southern-based civil society. But we see, understand that this is impact, but the main problem is we cannot measure this is our message or not. You already mentioned that, but I want to mention the main thing is, think tank is more like an advocacy, not only just a production of knowledge. Is it right, or that, can you explain?
Sorry, Jamsha, can you just repeat the question? I'm not sure I understood. So what you're trying to ask is how do you illustrate that the work you're doing has actually had?
We are talking and the PBS presentation. You are talking about M&E, like a or like a more the the I understand that Tinta is more advocacy organization than the only produce the knowledge.
I think it depends on how you define yourself. Within think tanks as well. And I sorry, I thought you guys had covered this in a previous session. There's one example that I use is the International Crisis Group. So they consider themselves a think tank, but they have a very specific mission, if you like. It's about conflict, and they advocate for very specific things because they are dealing with something that's very, very tangible. Whereas I think a research, well, not a research, and then you have a think tank like, I'm trying to think of another one. There's another think tank here in Europe called E3G, which is an environmental group. And again, they're very advocacy based. But I think it really depends on how you define yourself as a think tank and what change you're trying to effect in the policy world. But I'm not sure that could you try to explain your question again? I'm really sorry. I'm not sure I'm quite getting it.
Actually, I am not. But the question to you, that my understanding that is that because of the PBS session, they are mentioned think tank is like a more not only academic institute, like they are more like they are between the media and like political party, and also they did like more influence something. The thing, the PBS and the first session are talking about that. Yeah. If depend on if we are advocate something, we need to easy to measure our impact.
Yes.
Yeah, but if we don't have a like a mission, or we don't have a like a advocate, we are not advocate something, but we are just production of knowledge. But it's difficult to measure the impact. This is my opinion. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I agree. And that's why I think your mission and your vision is so important, because you have to sort of refer back to that at each stage of, at every stage. I mean, when you're putting together a project proposal for a donor, you have to reflect your mission and your vision in that, from the way that you're coming up with what you want to do within a project or within a program. You have to refer back to your mission and your vision, because then you're sort of, you don't have a direction. Where are you going? What are you really advocating for? So yes, you have to, I think that's critical. Absolutely. Okay, I see that there's some comments in the chat, not directly related to think tanks, but organizational reinventing organizations. Thank you, Sophie, for sharing that. Okay.
Also, Felix has raised his hand.
Okay, please. I'm sorry, I don't see everybody on my screen, so please just.
Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon. My name is Felix. I'm leading a think tank / consulting firm in Myanmar, focused on economics and business, so more the private sector space. What I would be interested in is at Carnegie, I mean, how are you basically managing the let's say external resources? I mean, you may work with let's say external researchers that are contributing to a paper, who might be co-authors. You might have partnerships and all, But I mean, how are you then? I mean, so, and all of these researchers will have their own kind of profile and personality, etc. You know, so they basically are also, you know, in some way, you know, shining stars at times. You know, how do you keep this brand, in fact, of Carnegie always, or how do you engage with these external partners when you put out your research products or when you hold events, etc.? So yeah, I don't know if that's clear, but I think it's a bit hard, you know, when you have a lot of you know, maybe similarly positioned think tanks that are all cooperating, doing joint events or something like this. You know, I mean, how you basically manage to keep this Carnegie brand always kind of in the spotlight.
Right. Are you talking mainly about organizational partnerships, Felix, or when we want to, for example, engage individual experts that are not necessarily part of the Carnegie network?
Yeah, I think that it's about both. So it's basically two separate issues. You know, I'm not sure how much you are working with external researchers or how much these are all basically fellows then of a Carnegie network. I'm not sure how this is working. Yeah.
Yeah, I can. So let me deal with the first one, the experts themselves. So I mean, Carnegie, again, I speak from a bit of a luxury position, and I do realize that. So we have over 100 scholars globally, all with varying affiliations with Carnegie. Some are actual staff, some are just engaged on a per project basis. But even with those, you know, 100 people, you're not necessarily going to be able to cover all the topics and issues that you want to do. So we've just recently, a very recent example actually is we've just launched this project called the European Democracy Hub, where we're bringing together experts from around the world to talk about European democracy and democratic engagement in various parts of the world, and how Europe is both funding and supporting groups that are involved in that work. And a lot of the scholars who are writing for that are not Carnegie people. They have their own affiliations. So I think one thing you need to think about when you're engaging with those people. It's very basic. Think about, you have to do background checks on people, unfortunately. It goes to your funders as well, right? You don't just accept money from anyone. I mean, they might dangle like €1 million in front of you, but you're not going to take that because maybe it's, you know, not necessarily the right partnership. So with external authors, we do background checks to make sure that they are in the values that they've represented in the past are also values that are compatible with us. Now, you're not necessarily always in that luxury position because maybe you're a new think tank and you don't have a reputation yet, and you're still trying to establish yourself. But, you know, that's actually when I think you need to be even more cautious, because at the very beginning, you know, you're still trying to establish yourself, and you need to be careful with who you're engaging with, because nowadays everything is public, everything is online. You can, you know, find information and things go viral very, very quickly. So the first thing, you know, make sure that you do your background checks and make sure that the people that you're engaging in your networks are actually that they're compatible with your own values as an organization. So we do that. It's also about the network. I talked about this earlier, you know, how, but don't forget that your network also has a network, right? So it's sort of like concentric circles in a way, that you have your contacts, but you want to work on a very specific issue. I'm sure that within your circle, there's somebody who knows somebody. And, you know, unfortunately, that's still how it works. It's very tribal, but that is still how it works, even in this virtual space. If I needed to work on a topic that I wasn't sure about, I would, you know, contact the person that I knew that had a peripheral knowledge of this issue and said, can you point me in, and say, can you point me in the right direction? And so, you know, networks and background checks, that's really important. Also historically, like how have you worked with these people before, maybe in a previous life, or people that have worked with them before can also give recommendations. So that's how we engage people individually. I mean, obviously that's when you have the opportunity to actually know about people. What if you come across a name and you really want to engage with that person and you don't know anybody, and you don't know them? You have to just send a cold email, unfortunately, and just hope that they react. In terms of partnerships, I mean, I think the principles, at least the first one, very much applies. You know, make sure you do your background checks on the organization that you're going to be partnering with, because again, it's a reflection on you. It's a reflection on what you're doing, and it has, you know, the bad thing about the internet is that things stay online for a very long time. They don't go away. Like before, you could just, you know, check a newspaper away and then you could forget about it. But now it just, you know, you could go back and find things that are 15 years old and it can come back and haunt you. So make sure that you're very selective in terms of your engagements. And that's sort of how we do it. I mean, I have to say that Carnegie is an old organization, so we're not always very innovative and creative in terms. We tend to go to the people that we've tended to work with in the past, just because it's about established relationships. It's about people that you know and trust. That's not to say that we don't, you know, work with new people, because we do all the time. But I think, you know, human beings, we tend to be creatures of habit, right? We tend to just repeat things that we've gotten used to in the past. And I think that also applies organizationally. We a lot of our donors, actually, we've worked with for years, and they've worked with us for years because we know each other, and they have the stability and we have the stability. And again, I realize I'm speaking from a very luxury position, but, you know, my first piece of advice is be critical and be selective about who you work with, because it reflects on you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that.
Sure. Enrique is here. Hi, Enrique. On measuring impact. Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can move on. I see, Andrea, we've got 20 minutes left. Okay. Share. All right. So we've talked about the leader, and let me just change slides now. Okay, these are some of the management tools that I have used, and that a lot of, you know, others have maybe used. I don't think we're going to have time to go into each and every one in detail. This happened to me last year too, Andrea. I think I'm going to have to do something about that. What I will do though is I will send you guys, and I'll send it to Andrea, and hopefully she can share that with you. I have a grid which sort of explains it a little bit. It's sort of like the grid, and it'll explain and define what it is, and you can do a little bit more research online. A lot of these are actually online. I've used most of them in the course of my career, and I wanted to talk about one in particular that I've found very useful. You know, why are management tools important? Your job as a leader and your job as a manager, and again, like to Sophie's point, this goes across, even if you're not at the top of the organization, if you're somewhere in the middle or, you know, lower end, your job is to build a great team, so that you have to have the right systems and the right tools, and there are a lot out there. Over the past few years, you know, Teresa made this point earlier, you know, things have changed in the think tank world, and skills have changed as well. We've moved from these sort of hard skills, I think, which I call the traditional skills of planning and budgeting and risk management, to more softer skills like collaboration and negotiation. And I think those two skill sets, the old and the new, they're still very important, but together they can be very powerful. And there are a lot of organizations out there who make it their living to come in and help your organization implement these. But I think you also, when doing these, you need to be careful be wary about the tools that are just fad tools, you know, the ones that like flavor of the week, because unless they become embedded in your organization, then they're not going to be very useful to you. So be wary about that, because it sounds, you know, exciting. Oh, I'm going to try this and I'm going to try that. But if you only do it once and then you don't go back to it again, then it doesn't really make much sense. One that I do actually like a lot and that I have used a lot, so I wanted to do this case study. It's called the expectation exchange. We talked earlier about how the pandemic has changed the way that we work. And again, Teresa covered it very well. We you know, suddenly found ourselves online and had to do all of these things online and had to adjust to working from your kitchen table. You know, and again, luxury position. We were, you know, we were very fortunate that our IT department managed to get the whole of the institution online very, very quickly. And that was all well and good. But I think our biggest challenge then became, in Brussels, we're a very small team. There's only 10 people. That's small compared to an organization of 200. I realize that's big compared to others, but everything's about perspective, right? So in Brussels, our team is 10 people, but we're a very close team. And we still remain a very close team. But it's very difficult when you're, you know, in an office environment daily and, you know, having conversations with people and brainstormings, to now suddenly move that into an online space. And one of the big challenges that we had this year is we had a huge turnover. Half of our staff, those 10 people, actually left because of new opportunities, and it was just time. But half of that team needed to be onboarded in a virtual environment, including my boss. My boss started in March, actually, and I haven't seen her. I've seen her once in person. The rest of the time has been virtual. And I think that has created, and it did create, I don't want to say the word misunderstandings because that's quite negative, but people who were coming in new, who were not used to ways of doing things, and people who were resistant to change and didn't want to necessarily continue, or didn't like having to be in this online space. And, you know, it's very difficult to deal with that. And when people are frustrated, when people are more worried about why is their laptop not working, or why don't they have this specific digital tool in order to do their work, which is important, they're not going to be focusing on the work. They're going to be focusing on their frustration. And, you know, one tool that I've used, and I didn't just use this during the pandemic, I've actually used it during times when we've gone through change management, for example, is the expectation exchange. Does anybody in the group know what that is? Have you guys talked about this? Okay, I'm just going to assume that's no, unless you shout at me and say no. So the expectation exchange it's a tool. It's quite an old tool, actually. You basically can use it in different situations. So what is it? It's a structured process for sharing perceptions and feedback, clarifying expectations, and finding out how to work together more effectively. You can use it on a one-on-one, you can use it team to team, manager to team, etc. And it prevents misunderstandings, promotes open relationships, and helps avoid potential problems or resolve difficult situations. So what is it exactly? Because I'm talking about this thing, and I think some of you look a bit confused. So you sit down with someone, or you sit down with your team, or your team to team sits together, and you have to prepare this in advance. You need to tell people that you're going to do this, because there's a little bit of homework to be done before it. So for example, Andrea, I'm going to call you out here. You and I are colleagues, and we have a problem because we're not getting along, and you're doing things that are just not working for me, and I'm doing things that are just not working for you. So our manager writes us, and Enrique writes us an email and says, you guys need to have an expectation exchange. This is what I think you guys need to do. You need to think about what Lizza, you need to think about what you expect from Andrea, and Andrea needs to do the same for you, and what you don't expect from her and what she doesn't expect from you. And this usually works best when you try to keep it to a minimum. So Andrea, I expect you to tell me exactly what I need to do. I expect you to reply to my emails. I don't expect you to respond to me during the weekend. I don't expect you to, so you start thinking through that, and then you both sit down together and you have a very frank and open conversation. Now, there's a couple of ground rules. Obviously, no insulting. Please respect each other. Give the process time. It's all well and good for Andrea and I to sit down for half an hour and talk about this, but then if we just then leave and don't come back to it, then there's no follow-up. It just doesn't go anywhere. So, you have to hold each other accountable to doing something to improve the relationship or to improve the process. There's a big temptation when you do this to dwell on the past. Don't do that. It's not helpful. You used to, let's focus on the future. Those are some of the tips, and I mean, this is not a magic bullet. It's not going to solve all of your problems, but from the experience that I've had over the years of using this, it has worked well, especially if you document it, and I mean follow up with it, and you bring it back and you embed it in your organization. It's not just about doing it once and then forgetting about it. It's about bringing it back again and again. And this really works well when you have tensions, or when you have a new manager coming in, because you both know what to expect from each other and what not to expect from each other. Okay, I see there are chats coming up. So let me just see. We used a lot in my organization. Oh, okay, great, May. Good to hear that. Do I have any questions? No? Okay, so I will just keep going because I think we've only got 10 minutes left.
Sorry, I have one question.
Yes, please.
Yes, is there, I'm from Myanmar. Is there any difference between think tank leadership style and other like NGO or private sector leadership style?
That's a very good question. I think some of the core traits are very much the same. What I said earlier about vision and network, I think that applies across the board, no matter what field you're in. But then, if you're in the corporate sector, you're driven by different things. If you're in an NGO, you're driven by different things, you as a person, and also as an organization. But I think the vision and the network are pretty much applicable across the board.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yes?
Yes, I have a question about the expectation issue. I just wanted to know where exactly or when exactly should we conduct such this exercise? Is it when there is a new staff in the organization, or after some time? When exactly? And should it be regular? Maybe I missed that part, but please, can you?
Of course, Donald, sure. I mean, I found over the years that it's whenever you have an issue with a staff member, it's useful. Relationships are cyclical. I think, sometimes you guys get along really well, and this happens with your staff too. And sometimes things are not going to go well. And it often happens when there are changes externally that your organization is facing. So you might need to do a staff restructure because you need to downsize, or you need to upsize. You need to bring on board new people. You need to add new functions to a team. And people, I'll use an example that we had recently. we had to make one of our core teams a little bit bigger. It was our comms team, and we needed to bring on board a new person. And so our existing team now is 3 people, but before it was 2. And just because of the sheer volume of work, we had to bring on an additional person. Now, the person who was in the junior role actually wanted the role of the position that we were advertising for. And we just, as a management, person, we didn't feel that they were quite ready for that role yet. So we sat down and had a conversation with them and said, we're going to advertise for this, but this is why, and explain them the situation. And I think I didn't on that occasion use the expectation exchange, and I should have, because I think it would have helped to clarify why we didn't in the end choose that person didn't choose to promote that person as opposed and bring in somebody else. Another time that I've used it was actually during the pandemic, because adjusting to being online means that people also have to adjust their work methods. And there were requests and expectations that were coming in from the staff that I hadn't even considered. I mean, things that, this might sound stupid, but basic stuff like, are you going to pay for my internet? Are you going to pay for, I don't know, coffee beans? Things like, no, you're at home, But again, an expectation exchange would have been helpful in those circumstances, because it very clearly from the beginning sets out what you should expect from me and I should expect from you. So you can apply it to all sorts of situations. And I think you can also apply it, I haven't done that yet, but you could apply it with your donors, the informal ones anyway. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Sure, Donald. Okay, I have 5 minutes, Andrea. I'm gonna get this done, I promise. All right. Share. Okay. The next thing that I wanted to talk about, and again, we'll look at this very quickly because. Okay. Structured creativity. So these are important. I mean, we've placed a lot of emphasis on soft skills related to people management. But I also think it's important to provide a space for your scholars and your staff, your people, basically, to contribute creatively. But people contribute creatively when they feel that they're in this together as a team, when they feel good. Like, you're not going to want to give your best ideas when you're not happy in your job. That's just normal. So again, like, this all goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and how important it is to emulate those values that you as an organization ascribe to across the board, and that includes managing your team and your staff. These are just some of the ways that we try to provide structured creativity sessions, and probably a lot of you guys have already used this forward planning session. So we do this quarterly. Sort of, you literally just sit down with a big sheet of paper before in a room all together with 20 people, you can't do that anymore. And just write down the big milestone events that are coming up on, the external calendar, or the projects that you have coming up, and then just think about how you can connect the different dots and what you want to do and how you want to do them. It's about planning out your activities well in advance. Blue sky meetings. So this we use when we have new projects coming in and we want to think creatively about, how we want to implement them in terms of like what space we have to think creatively, because sometimes you're quite restricted by the project application. But you can, within those parameters, have these blue sky meetings. Brown bag lunches. This is something that we do actually monthly. So I think it's important for your operational staff to also meet regularly with your scholars, but in an informal context. So what we do is we have these exchanges where our scholars can explain to our ops staff a recent paper that they've written and the key takeaways, because, you know, if your ops team are the one that are out there trying to get the word out, they also need to buy into the content and the policy research. And at the same time, your researchers also need to understand the challenges that your different teams face. So this brown bag lunch, everybody brings their own lunch and just sits down and has an informal chat. Again, it's quite structured. And then, sorry about that. And then, of course, the traditional retreats, which I think everybody has participated in. So I will stop there because I'm out of time. Andrea, I'm so sorry.
No problem. I think thank you very much for this. I think the questions indicate how interested people have been on your experience beyond the presentation slides, and it's good for us to adapt to what you were saying, but also to what piqued everybody's interest. So I'll let you do some final wrap up notes, or if there are any final burning questions. I had one thing though that I wanted to ask is, you mentioned some tools and resources that you use in Carnegie. I was wanting to ask if there's anything that you could share with us that is not private. I was really keen on the background checks because of like personal interest. But if there's any tools that you can share with us,
who are you keeping an eye on, Andrea?
Everybody.
Yeah, so our background checks are actually, we have actually software that we use for this. I don't remember the name of it. I can find out and I'll let you know, because it's probably something that you can buy. We mainly use the background checks, not just mainly, but a lot of the times for our donors, actually individual donors specifically. Because the last thing you want to have happen is you have somebody give you money and then you realize, oh my God, they've been involved in a murder or something like that. Now, that's never happened, but you know, you have to do background checks. Okay, there we go. I think Andrea's already responded. Do you have any other questions? You know, if there's one thing that or two things that you take away from this session, one is the VCR. You know, those three pillars, I think operationally are really important. And then the second thing, you know, from a norm-based perspective, I do really think the values, the social contract that we talked about earlier, it's really important, both the value and the values that you ascribe to, because it goes across everything.
Thank you, Lisa. That was really interesting. I'm really glad that I listened to the whole presentation this time, as I didn't before. And I'm sorry, but we have run out of time for this one. So if you'll join me in, say, doing the virtual clap or a virtual reaction to the session. So thank you, Lisa. This was really great. I don't know if you can see everybody is either clapping or sharing some comments on what you on the presentation. So we will be uploading the session, and thank you very much for being with us on a second time, and we look forward for having you at the third school next year.
Thank you everyone. I really also enjoyed the exchange with you, and I promise I will send to Andrea the definitions of the management tools so that you have them.
Great.
Enjoy the rest of the school.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.